I have told this story at 3 dinner tables and 1 christening, and I am told I tell it badly, that I linger on the wrong moments and rush past the ones that would make a woman weep. Perhaps. But I was there for all of it, and I will tell it my way. My name is Henry Ashby. I am the 2nd Baron Ashby of Crestmere, neighbor to the Hartwell estate for 32 years, and the closest friend Edmund Hartwell ever permitted himself. I say permitted because Edmund did not collect friends the way other men did. He collected silence and distance, and the company of books that could not answer back. The friendship was inherited, more or less. His father and mine had been inseparable, and when both of them died within a year of each other, Edmund and I found ourselves the accidental inheritors of an old arrangement. We kept it. It suited us both. Edmund was the Duke of Hartwell by the time he was 26. He wore the title the way a man wears an overcoat 2 sizes too large, not quite at ease in it, aware of its weight, constantly adjusting. He was not cruel. I want to be clear about that before I go any further because some accounts I have heard since lean toward a version of Edmund that is not fair. He was not cruel. He was cold, yes, or what passed for cold in a county where most men wore their hearts on their sleeves and their debts on their wives' shoulders. Edmund kept everything inside. He had had his reasons, and they were not my reasons to share. What I will say is that there had been a grief when he was young, and it had taught him early that feeling too much was a thing with consequences. So he controlled it. He was very good at controlling things. He ran Hartwell Park with a precision that made his tenants comfortable and his neighbors nervous. He was not unkind to his servants. He was prompt in his correspondence and unhurried in his speech. He rose early, worked long, walked his grounds in all weather, and knew the name and circumstance of every family on his estate, not out of warmth exactly, but out of the same scrupulousness he applied to everything. Hartwell, under his management, was a well-kept machine, and he was its most reliable part. At county dinners he was unfailingly present and unfailingly correct, and he had a way of listening to a man speak for 15 minutes and then answering in 2 sentences that left no ground for argument. I admired it. Most people found it unsettling. Young women who were brought into the county with hopes in that direction found it devastating, because he was also, in the physical sense, an extremely handsome man, and the conjunction of handsome and formidable and apparently untouchable is, in my experience, the combination most likely to make a young woman determined to try. 3 had tried in the years since he took the title. He had been courteous to all of them, and deflecting, and ultimately unavailable in a way that offered no single moment to object to. He was very good at that, too. The one person in the world who was not in the least unsettled by Edmund Hartwell was his grandmother. The Dowager Duchess of Hartwell, Cornelia, to those few she allowed to call her anything, was, at the time of this story, 78 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and in possession of an intelligence so focused and so patient that it could fairly be called dangerous. She had outlived a husband, 2 sons, and a daughter, and she regarded this as the consequence of having always been the more careful person in the room. She was not sentimental. She was, however, deeply, strategically loving, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways more powerful. She loved Edmund the way a very good gardener loves a difficult plant, with full knowledge of its nature and a clear view of what it needed that it would not ask for itself. She had watched Edmund for 6 years since he came into the title. She had watched him manage Hartwell impeccably and manage himself into a kind of decorative isolation. She had watched him turn away 3 suitable young women with a politeness so thorough it left them nothing to object to. She had watched him spend his evenings alone with books, and his mornings alone with correspondence, and his afternoons alone with the estate, and she had formed a view. I know all of this because she told me. She summoned me to Hartwell Park on a Tuesday in October, 5 years ago now, and I went because one does not decline a summons from Cornelia Hartwell. She received me in her sitting room, a small, warm space on the south side of the house that smelled of beeswax and good paper, and she poured tea herself and told me what she intended to do. "I have found the right girl," she said. I said I was not aware Edmund was looking. "He is not," she agreed. "That is part of the difficulty. The other difficulty is that if I tell him I have found her, he will spend 3 months constructing reasons why she is wrong and another 3 proving it to himself. And by that time the girl will have married someone sensible, and we will all have lost something irreplaceable." She sipped her tea. "So I am not going to tell him. I am simply going to bring her here." I asked on what pretext. Companion, she said. I have needed a companion for years. I am old and I live in a very large house, and it is not unreasonable. No one will think twice. I asked about the girl. Her name is Cecily Vane. She is the eldest daughter of the Reverend Thomas Vane of Alderton, a living of no great consequence, a house of no great size, and a family of no great means. She is 24. She is not, by the standards of this county, a beauty, though I think the standards of this county are frequently wrong. She is uncommonly clever, which has been held against her. She has a tongue that says things other people are thinking and doesn't always wait for permission. She once corrected Sir John Faraday's Latin at a public reading and then apologized in better Latin than he used, which he has not forgiven. The dowager set down her cup. She is very poor, very capable, and entirely, completely herself. That is the thing, Henry. She is herself. She has not yet decided to be someone else for the benefit of a room. Edmund has never met such a person, not since his mother died. I sat with that for a moment. Does she know about this scheme? I asked. Certainly not, the dowager said. She knows that the Dowager Duchess of Hartwell requires a companion for the winter season and that the compensation is generous. She knows Hartwell Park has an excellent library. Those are the facts I communicated. And Edmund knows I am taking on a companion. He said it was sensible. He did not ask her name. She smiled. It was a very contained smile. He will meet her at dinner on Thursday. After that, it is between them and the ordinary passage of time. I said something about the ethics of the thing. She looked at me patiently. I am not arranging their marriage, she said. I am arranging their introduction. Everything after that will be their own doing. I am merely optimizing the geography. I rode home and thought about it for 2 days and decided it was not my business. I was wrong about that, of course. It very much became my business. But that is getting ahead. Thursday came. I was invited to dinner, to ease the introduction, the dowager told me, though I suspect she also wanted a witness. Edmund was at the head of the table in the way he was always at the head of tables. Precise, composed, slightly too formal for a family dinner, which was the only kind of dinner there was at Hartwell in winter. His grandmother sat at the other end, arranging herself with the satisfaction of a woman who has set a scene she intends to watch. I was placed to Edmund's right, which meant I had a clear view of the door when Miss Cecily Vane was shown in. She was not quite what I had expected. The dowager's description, not a conventional beauty, was accurate but incomplete. She was a young woman of middle height with brown hair that had been arranged with care and was already, by the time she reached the dining room, beginning to disagree with its pins. She had a face that was interesting rather than pretty, good bones, expressive dark eyes, a mouth that I could see immediately was accustomed to movement, to words, to opinion. She wore a dark green dress that was well-made but not fashionable, and she came into the room the way people come into rooms when they are not entirely sure what they are walking into, but have decided in advance not to be alarmed by it. There was a composure to her that was not performance. She was simply not, it appeared, a woman who was frightened by much. Edmund rose. He was courteous. He said the words one says. Miss Vane curtsied with a correctness that did not manage to be stiff. It had a quality of being slightly tongue-in-cheek, as if she had decided to do the thing perfectly and then decided that was sufficient and she was done performing. I noticed it. Edmund appeared not to. We sat. The first course was served. The dowager made the introductions that ceremony required and asked Miss Vane about her journey, and Miss Vane said it had been pleasantly uneventful except for a wheel that had wobbled on the Keswick Road, and given her 40 minutes of interesting uncertainty about whether she was going to arrive at all or end the afternoon in a ditch. Edmund said he would have the road seen to. Miss Vane said that would be very kind, and she said it without a particular weight of gratitude, simply as a statement of fact, the natural response to something useful being offered. She did not elaborate. She did not fill the silence with further thanks or with remarks about the generosity of the Duke's estate. She picked up her soup spoon. There was a pause of the kind that settles over dinner tables when no one is quite sure whose turn it is, and Edmund asked, with the manner of a man who has decided he is obligated to make one conversational inquiry, what had brought Miss Vane to Hartwell beyond the practical considerations. She looked at him. It was not a combative look. It was a considering one, the look of a woman who is deciding whether a question deserves an honest answer or a convenient one. Your grandmother's library, she said. She mentioned it has one of the best collections of natural philosophy in the county. and I have been wanting to read Herschel's astronomical papers for 2 years and have not been able to get hold of them." Edmund said nothing for a moment. "You have an interest in astronomy." "I have an interest in most things," she said. "Astronomy in particular. My father has a telescope, and we have spent a great many evenings looking through it at things we could not identify, which is both humbling and improving." Edmund looked at her with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a man who has classified something and is now discovering that the classification was imprecise. He recovered quickly. He asked about her father's living, and she answered about the living, and the dinner proceeded in an orderly fashion, and I watched Edmund and I watched Miss Vane, and I thought, well, the old woman may have been right. The trouble began, or what Edmund chose to experience as trouble, after dinner, when the Dowager had taken Miss Vane off to see her rooms, and I stayed with Edmund over port. "She is entirely unsuitable," he said. I asked in what particular. "In every particular." He turned his glass, watching the firelight move in the wine. "She is a vicar's daughter of no means, no connections, and what appears to be a comprehensive inability to defer to anyone on anything. She contradicted the footman about the vintage of the Bordeaux, correctly, I thought, but that is beside the point. She will not," he paused, searching for the word. "She will not fit." I said I had not been aware we were trying to fit anyone. He looked at me with the particular patience he reserved for statements he found willfully obtuse. "She is a companion for my grandmother," he said. "I merely note that she is not what I would have expected." I agreed that she did not seem to be what anyone would have expected. He poured another glass and said no more about it, and I thought the subject was closed. What I did not know, what I did not learn until Miss Vane told me herself, much later, was that, as she had been led to her rooms that evening, she had passed the door of the library. And from inside the library came the sound of Edmund's voice saying the words I have already reported. "She is entirely unsuitable." She stopped. The Dowager's maid, slightly ahead, did not notice immediately. Miss Vane stood in the corridor and listened to the Duke of Hartwell deliver his verdict on her, and then she went to her rooms and sat on the edge of the bed, and felt the sharp, particular humiliation of having that door close before she had even knocked. She had come with her trunk and her excitement about Herschel and a genuine willingness to be useful, and she had been dismissed by a man who had known her for precisely 2 hours and 20 minutes. She told me later that she spent perhaps 20 minutes in that feeling, and then she decided, and this was so characteristically Cecily that I laughed when she described it, that if he had already made up his mind, then she was under no obligation to try to change it, and she could simply be herself, which was what she had intended to do anyway. The humiliation did not vanish. It settled into something quieter and harder. She put it in a drawer in her mind and closed the drawer, and went to unpack her trunk, and in the morning she would find the library and read Herschel. The next morning she asked the Dowager's butler where the library was. Edmund was in it. He was standing at the window with a letter in one hand and the expression of a man who has been interrupted in something he was not actually doing. She came in, said good morning with the ease of a woman who had decided to treat this library as exactly what it was, a room full of books, went directly to the shelves, and began to look for Herschel. He watched her. She moved along the shelves with the purposeful focus of someone who knows what she is looking for and will find it, running her finger along the spines, reading titles in the efficient half-second each required, not performing interest but genuinely engaged in the search. She did not look at him. Not because she was avoiding him, she was genuinely occupied with the shelves. But also, she told me later, she had made a private decision not to perform for him. If he had already decided, then there was nothing to perform. She would simply be present in the room and find her book. Edmund said, "The Herschel papers are in the lower left cabinet, the one with the brass lock. The key is in the top drawer of the writing desk." She turned, she looked at him. He was not looking at her, he had gone back to his letter. "Thank you," she said. She found the key, opened the cabinet, extracted the papers. They were well preserved, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges, but the print clean and sharp. She sat down at the long table to the left of the window, not at the end nearest him, not at the end furthest from him, simply at the place that had the best light, and spread the papers and began to read. Edmund continued with his correspondence at his own desk, which was at the other end of the room, and they passed the next hour and 20 minutes in a silence that was, against all expectation, not uncomfortable. When she rose to leave, he said, without looking up, The chapter on the nebular hypothesis is on page 43. The others are preparatory. She paused at the door. Have you read it? Yes. Did you find it convincing? He was quiet for a moment, in a way that suggested he was considering his answer properly rather than dismissing the question. The mathematics is sound. The philosophical implications require more thought. She said they always do, and left. He told me later, much later, when we had arrived at the part of the friendship where he told me things, that he had sat at his desk for several minutes after she left, staring at nothing. He said he was not sure what he had been expecting. A woman who would be flustered by the library, perhaps, who would treat it as a backdrop for conversation about the estate or the county or himself. A woman who would attempt to draw him into flattering exchanges about Hartwell's history. A woman who wanted something from him, even something ordinary, his opinion, his attention, his approval. Miss Vane had wanted Herschel. She had taken Herschel and gone. It was, he said, extremely unusual, and he was not entirely certain how to classify it. The weeks that followed have a quality, in my memory of hearing about them, of a man being quietly unsettled by something he cannot quite name. Edmund was used to Hartwell running on his schedule. He rose at 7, breakfasted alone, spent the morning on estate correspondence, walked the grounds in the early afternoon, read in the evenings. It was orderly. He did not dislike it, he had built it, and it suited him, and it was entirely under his control. What he discovered over the following weeks was that Miss Vane had, without particular intention and with no apparent strategy, begun to inhabit the same geography in a way that complicated the orderliness without disrupting it. She was in the library most mornings, but she moved through it differently than he did. She made notes in a small brown journal, writing with a speed and compression that suggested a mind that was always several steps ahead of the hand. She occasionally muttered to herself in a way she did not seem aware of. She sometimes laughed quietly at something on the page and then looked up with a slightly self-conscious expression when she realized she was not alone, and met his eye with the direct, unembarrassed acknowledgement of someone who has been caught doing something not particularly embarrassing, and then went back to reading. She did not seek his conversation. She did not avoid it either. If he said something, she answered. If he did not say something, she did not attempt to manufacture an exchange. She was in the kitchen garden on afternoons when the weather permitted. The dowager had given her free use of it, and she had apparently decided that the neglected south wall bed required her attention. Edmund passed through the garden on his afternoon walks and found her there 3 times in the first week, on her knees in the dirt, doing something purposeful with a bulb and a trowel, with an old cloak thrown over her dress and her hair disarranged by the wind. And she would look up and say good afternoon with the ease of someone who did not find a duke appearing in her garden particularly remarkable. The 3rd time he stopped, he looked at what she was doing, which was clearing years of matted growth from the base of the south wall in a methodical progression from left to right. It was not elegant work. Her hands were dirty. She had a small pile of extracted roots beside her that she appeared to be sorting by some system he could not immediately identify. He said, "What are you planting?" She said, "Narcissus, and some crocus along the wall if the soil cooperates. It has not been turned in years." She sat back on her heels and looked at the bed with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite frustration, the look of someone assessing a long project at its beginning. "It may resist me." He looked at the bed. Then he said, and he told me afterward he had said it before he had decided to, "My mother planted that bed. She did not keep it up in her last years." A pause. Miss Vane looked at the bed with a slightly different quality of attention, the attention of someone who is now looking at something that belongs to a story she does not know. She did not press. She did not ask about the mother, or about the last years, or about any of the rest of it. "Then I will try to make something worthy of it," she said. He said nothing, he walked on. But I am told, by himself, eventually, in the way he told me things when he had decided to, that he stopped at the corner of the garden wall and stood for a moment with his hand on the stone, not entirely sure why he had said what he had said or why it had felt, briefly, like setting something down. He had not spoken of his mother in years. Miss Vane had not asked. The moment had simply arrived, briefly, and passed, and she had answered it without fanfare or sympathy or the particular kind of careful handling people gave him when grief was implied. She had simply said what was true and turned back to the soil. The dowager watched all of this with the patience of a woman who has planted bulbs before and knows you cannot rush the season. She told me about the library. She told me about the garden. She told me about the evening in the third week when Miss Vane had appeared in the drawing room after dinner carrying the Herschel papers and her brown journal, and the dowager had asked her to explain something she had found interesting, and Cecily had explained it, sitting forward in her chair, the journal open on her knee, sketching a diagram in the margin as she spoke, with such unself-conscious precision and such genuine enthusiasm that the room seemed to enlarge around her. Edmund had come in late, having expected to spend the evening in his study. He had seen her sitting there. He had sat down without taking off his coat and listened. He argued with her, the dowager said to me, with a satisfaction she was not bothering to conceal. Not unpleasantly. She argued back. She said the nebular hypothesis was not merely a mathematical proposition, but required a philosophical commitment to the idea that the universe proceeds by natural law without exception, and he said that required a leap of a different kind, and she said that was exactly what she found interesting about it. They went on for 40 minutes. I dozed off in my chair, quite deliberately, you understand, and when I woke they were still at it. I asked who had prevailed. Neither, she said. They arrived at an agreement that the question required more data than either of them had, which I believe is what scientists call a productive conclusion. She sipped her tea. He was still in the room at 11 o'clock. He is never in this room at 11 o'clock. I said that was promising. It is very promising, she agreed. What is less promising is that he will now spend the next 3 weeks persuading himself it was merely an interesting intellectual exchange, which will get him nowhere but will occupy him sufficiently that he will not notice himself looking for her in every room he enters. She was exactly right. Edmund spent the next 3 weeks persuading himself it was merely an interesting intellectual exchange. I know this because I visited Hartwell 4 times in November, which is unusual for me. I have my own estate to run, and November is not a social month. But the dowager had made it clear she valued my observations, and I found I was curious enough to give them. Edmund was different, not visibly, not in any way that would read from across the county. But I had known him since we were boys, and I could see it. He was present in a way he normally was not. At dinner he asked the dowager what Miss Vane had been reading that afternoon, with the manner of a man asking about something entirely incidental, and then listened to the answer with attention that was not incidental. He left the library when she came in twice, and stayed 3 times, and the balance of that was shifting in a direction he had not, I thought, yet admitted to himself. He had also, I noticed, begun to read things she had mentioned. This sounds small. For Edmund it was not small. Edmund read according to a system. There was always a list, always a sequence, always a reason. He had been working through a particular series of scientific volumes in a particular order for the better part of a year. I noticed, in November, that the sequence had been interrupted. There were books on the table in the library that were not part of the sequence, and that had the look of being recently opened. One of them was a collection of writings on natural history that I had heard Cecily discuss at dinner 3 weeks earlier. Another was a volume on medieval agricultural practices in the northern counties. He had not been interested in medieval agriculture before Cecily arrived. I did not say any of this to him. I stored it. He was also, and this was what told me the most, beginning to be irritated by her. Not genuinely. Not the cold, controlled irritation he deployed against people who wasted his time or failed his estate. This was the kind of irritation that has something else underneath it, the kind that appears when a thing keeps mattering more than you have decided it should. She had asked him once, directly and without particular softness, why the east wing of the house was closed. He had said it was not in use. She had said she understood that but wondered whether there was a reason, since the windows faced south and the light from that side would be considerable. He had said it was a large house, and some parts were unnecessary. She had not pushed. She had simply looked at him for a moment with those attentive eyes, the look of someone noting something carefully, and moved on to a question about whether the attic gallery had a skylight, which it did. He mentioned the east wing question to me 3 days later. She asked about the east wing, he said. I said I supposed she was curious about the house. She does not ask about anything for no reason, he said, in a tone that was hard to interpret. He was standing at the window of his study, looking out at the park where the November rain was making the lawns gray and the paths shine. She had already mapped the light from every window in the house. She knew what the south side would give. She was asking about the rooms. I said that was probably true. She was asking about my mother, he said. He stopped. Then, the east wing was my mother's wing. The rooms are hers. I closed them when she died. It has been 11 years and I have not. He stopped again. The sentence had no ending available or none he was prepared to offer. I don't know why I'm telling you this. I said he was probably telling me because he had told almost no one, and the keeping of it had become difficult. He didn't reply for a moment. Then he said quietly, "She didn't say any of that, she just asked about the wing." I said yes. He turned from the window. His face was doing what Edmund's face did when something was happening inside it that he had not quite managed to close off. A slight tightening, a precision in the eyes, the expression of a man who has been caught in the middle of something and is reassembling himself. "She is still entirely unsuitable," he said. I said, "I know you believe that." He looked at me. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said carefully, "that you have told yourself she is unsuitable so many times in the past 6 weeks that the word has lost most of its meaning. And I think you know it." He said nothing. He went back to his desk and picked up a letter, and I understood that the conversation was over. But I noticed he did not contradict me. December arrived, and with it the county's social obligations, which descended on Hartwell as they did on every estate. The calls, the card parties, the dinners at neighbors' houses, the long evenings of collective pretense that everyone was enjoying themselves very much. Edmund endured these. He was correct at all of them, and he would have been largely invisible at most of them, were it not for the fact that his grandmother had begun including Miss Vane in the social engagements to which she herself was invited, and Miss Vane had a quality of being noticed. Not because she performed, that was the opposite of what she did. She was simply very present. She listened with the full weight of her attention. She answered when spoken to in a way that made the questioner feel the question had been worth asking, and she had a dry, light sense of humor that arrived unexpectedly and with perfect timing. The humor was never unkind. It was more precise than unkind. It found the exact moment when someone had said something slightly absurd and acknowledged it, gently, in a way that made everyone laugh, including the person who had said the absurd thing. I watched 3 men in one evening discover, somewhat to their own surprise, that they had been talking to her for 20 minutes and had found it very agreeable. She also had the useful quality of seeing through people without making them feel it. She could identify a bore or a snob within 2 minutes of meeting them, and manage them with a cheerfulness so genuine that the bore thought he had made an excellent impression. Edmund saw all of this. I know he did because I watched him watch her. He did it with the subtlety of a very controlled man who does not wish to be caught watching, a glance here, a pause there, the alignment of his attention that was not obvious unless you knew what you were looking for. But I had known Edmund for 30 years. I knew what I was looking for. At the Fothergill card party in the 3rd week of December, there was a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, a widow of considerable social standing in the county who had decided, on no particular evidence, that she did not like Miss Vane. She was not openly unkind. She was the more dangerous variety, the kind who is sweetly limiting. She introduced Miss Vane to people with a slight emphasis on her father's small living and no emphasis on anything else. She asked after the Reverend's health with a warmth that was entirely about reminding everyone of the context. She asked Miss Vane, in a group of 5, whether she found Hartwell very grand after what she was used to, the question designed as a compliment and landing as something else. Miss Vane said, "I find it beautiful, though I confess I noticed the library first and the grandeur second. Your drawing room has some very fine volumes as well. Is that a first edition of the Philosophical Transactions behind you?" Mrs. Caldwell, who did not know whether it was, turned to look. The group laughed, lightly and genuinely, and Miss Vane moved the conversation elsewhere with an ease that was very close to grace. Edmund was across the room. He had watched the whole thing. I do not think he was aware that he had crossed the room until he was already there, standing at Miss Vane's shoulder, addressing the group with some remark about the Fothergill wine that was just precisely engaging enough to draw the group's attention, and just precisely easy enough to allow Miss Vane to step slightly back and breathe. After a moment he turned to her and said, quietly enough for the group not to hear, "Mrs. Caldwell is not worth your time." She looked at him. "I know," a pause, "I didn't need rescuing." "I know," he said. I came anyway. She looked at him a moment longer than necessary. Something moved across her face that I could not entirely read at that distance. Then she said, "Thank you," and the two words were different this time from the two words she had said in the library on the first morning. There was more in them. He did not reply, but he stayed beside her for the rest of the evening, which was not a thing Edmund Hartwell did at social gatherings. He had his rounds to make, his necessary conversations, the county obligations that were as structured as the rest of his life. He made them, but he returned. He returned to her side 3 times, each return natural seeming to everyone else, each return something I recognized as chosen. The third time he had brought her a glass of wine she had not asked for, and she had taken it with a slight lift of her brow that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of something she was not yet naming. The dowager found me at the end of the evening and said, "He brought her wine." I said I had noticed. "He has never brought anyone wine," she said. I said that might be an overstatement. "In 30 years, she said firmly, "I have never seen that man bring a woman wine who was not a family member. He is not a wine-bringing man. He is a wine-having-sent man." There is a difference. She looked across the room to where Edmund and Miss Vane were in a conversation that appeared to be going very well. The two of them turned slightly away from the room in a way that was not deliberate but had become so. "She has not asked him for anything," the dowager said. "Not his money, not his title, not his good opinion. She came here for Herschel, and she found the east wing closed, and she planted his mother's garden, and she has not asked for a single thing." Her voice was quiet. "He has never had that before, Henry. Not from a woman his own age, not since his mother. Everyone wants something from him. His tenants want management. His neighbors want alliance. The young women who are brought into his path want the title and the estate and whatever version of him they have decided they can reach." She paused. "Miss Vane wants Herschel, and to fix the south wall bed, and apparently to argue about the nebular hypothesis. She is not performing for him, and he does not know what to do with that because nothing in his life has prepared him for it." I thought about Edmund at 7 years old, when his mother died, and the 7-year-old turned quiet and careful, and built the first version of the walls it would take him 30 years to lower. I thought about a woman in a corridor hearing herself called unsuitable, choosing to simply be herself. January was cold and long, the way January is in a large country house when the grounds are frozen, and the social season has thinned, and there is little to do but inhabit the space and find what you are to each other in it. The dowager complained of a cough and kept to her rooms for a week, which meant that Edmund and Miss Vane were left to the machinery of the house without her comfortable mediation. I heard about this period in sections, from the dowager, from Edmund, and eventually from Cecily herself, and have tried to compose it into something coherent, though I am aware that a week lived is different in character from a week described. What seems to have happened is this: they found each other's company necessary. Not sought in any forward sense, necessary. The way a fire is necessary on a cold evening, not because you decided to need warmth, but because the cold is real and the fire is there. Edmund had a habit of going to the library after supper. Miss Vane had the same habit. They stopped pretending the coincidence was accidental, or rather, they never said it was not accidental, but they also stopped arranging to be elsewhere. They read. They talked about what they read. Edmund had a range of knowledge that was broad in the way of a man who has spent years with good books, and the solitude to digest them properly. And Miss Vane had a range of knowledge that was similarly broad but differently arranged. She had been educated partly by her father and partly by herself, in the autodidact's somewhat anarchic fashion, which meant she had deep fluency in areas. Edmund had only studied formally and surprising gaps in areas he considered fundamental. And the combination produced conversations that were not like the conversations either of them had with anyone else. They surprised each other regularly. Edmund found it, I am using his word, invigorating. Miss Vane found it, I think, something she had not known she was looking for. On the 4th evening of the dowager's confinement to her rooms, Edmund came to the library at his usual hour, and found Miss Vane at the long table with 3 books open in front of her and the brown journal beside her, and the look of a woman who has just been proven slightly wrong about something and is adjusting. She looked up when he came in and said, without preamble, "Your navigation section has a copy of Harrison's papers that contradicts what Herschel says about the method of determining longitude by stellar transit. I want to know if they are saying different things or the same thing differently." He crossed to the table and looked at the books. He said, "They are saying different things about different problems." She said, "I thought that might be it. But I wanted someone to confirm it before I wrote it down." He sat down across from her without being invited, which was, he told me, the moment he became aware that he sat down without being invited. He had not done that in his library with a person present in a very long time. He had sat at his own desk at the far end of the room. He had sat beside the fire. He had not sat across from someone at the table at this hour in the way you sit when you intend to be there for a while. "Show me what Herschel says," he said. She turned the page. They were there until well past midnight. When the fire had burned very low and the candles were nearly gone, she had looked up from the journal and said, "I am keeping you." He said, "You are not." She looked at him. "It is very late." "I know," he said. "I don't mind it." She looked at him for a moment with the considering look he had come to recognize, the one where she was deciding whether a thing deserved a direct answer or a careful one. Then she went back to the journal and wrote the last thing she had been writing and closed it. "In that case," she said, "I think we have solved it." They had not entirely solved it. They came back to it the following evening and the evening after that. The books had a way of not quite closing. She had been clever her entire life in a county that did not particularly want a clever vicar's daughter. Her father loved her mind. Her father was also the one person she was fairly certain loved it. Other men of her acquaintance found it useful when they wanted their Latin corrected or their accounts reviewed, and an inconvenience the rest of the time. She had learned, not bitterly but practically, to hold the cleverest parts of herself in reserve in most company, the way you keep your best coat for weather that requires it. It was not that she was ashamed of her own mind. She simply knew that producing it at a county dinner was about as welcome as producing a terrier, potentially interesting, but not quite what was wanted. She had made her peace with that, or thought she had, until she sat in a library at Hartwell and argued about natural philosophy with a man who argued back with equal conviction and zero condescension, and came back the next evening to continue. She told me, when we finally had the kind of conversation that allowed for such things, in the spring of her first year as the Duchess, walking back from the village while Edmund dealt with a problem in the North Field, that what had undone her eventually was not that Edmund was kind. She had not expected kindness, and kindness would not have been sufficient. What undone her was that he was genuinely interested. Not in her as a woman, not in her as a person with a pleasant manner, but in what she was actually saying. He listened the way he appeared to do everything, with complete attention, as though the thing in front of him was the only thing in the world. She had not had that before, not from someone who was also capable of disagreeing with her, and the combination of being fully heard and fully challenged was, she said, the most disorienting thing she had encountered in 24 years of life. She had not planned to fall in love with the Duke of Hartwell. She had planned to read Herschel. She said this with a particular dry precision, and I said I thought the Dowager had known it would happen, and she said she was quite sure the Dowager had known, and she was not certain whether to be grateful or alarmed by that, and probably it was both. Then she laughed, which was the sound of a woman who has decided that being right about something does not require you to be unhappy about how it happened. He told her one evening in the second week of January about his mother's telescope. It was in the East Wing. He had not opened the room in 11 years. He did not tell her this as a confession or an unburdening. He told her in the context of a discussion about Herschel's methods of systematic observation, almost as a parenthetical, and then stopped, as if he had surprised himself. Miss Vane looked at him without performing. She did not widen her eyes or say something careful about grief. She said, "She must have been someone who looked carefully at things." He was quiet for a moment. "She was." "Then the telescope is in good company," she said, meaning the Herschel papers, meaning the library, meaning the house that held both, and he understood all of it without needing it explained. He told me later that he had sat for a long time after she went up to her rooms, in the library, in the dark, with the fire burning down to ash. He said he had not been able to identify what he was feeling, which was itself unusual. He was very good at identifying things. He thought it might be something in the neighborhood of relief. He had been carrying the East Wing for 11 years in the way you carry a grief that has no available language, not in torment exactly, but in a constant low-level management of something heavy, and she had named the thing in it without touching the wound. She had said, "The telescope is in good company," and he had found that the company she meant included herself. He also said he had sat there long enough to arrive at a conclusion that frightened him considerably, that he did not want her to leave in the spring when the companion arrangement ended. That he had somehow, without noticing the exact moment, arrived at a place where Hartwell Park was different with her in it, more inhabited, more itself, more like the house it had been when his mother was alive, and moved through it, and made it feel as though it was for living in rather than only for managing. The thought of her departure had the quality of something he did not want to examine directly. He sat with this conclusion for 2 weeks. He took it apart and examined its components and looked for the error. He found no error. This alarmed him considerably. The dowager recovered from her cough in the middle of January and found, upon emerging from her rooms, a household that was in all externally observable respects unchanged, and was in every other respect entirely different. She told me this when I came for dinner at the end of the month. She seemed pleased in the way of a woman who has been right about something she was not entirely certain of, and finds the vindication satisfying without needing to announce it. "They have been in the library until midnight," she said. I said that was late for Edmund. "He is never in the library at midnight," she said. "He is never anywhere at midnight except asleep. He rose at 7 this morning and was correspondences by 8, and I saw no sign in him that he had been up until midnight arguing about stellar catalogues." She paused. "He was humming." I said Edmund did not hum. "Edmund does not hum," she agreed, and yet. February came in cold and clear, and with it the social season resumed in earnest. There was a dinner at Ravenswood, Sir Thomas Fothergill's estate, 8 miles east of Hartwell, a larger affair than usual, 20-odd people, the kind of gathering that the county used to display itself to itself. Edmund attended because he was obligated to. He brought his grandmother because she was fully recovered and had decided she wished to go. Miss Vane came because the dowager wished for her company, and because she had by February earned something in the county that was not quite a position but functioned as one. She was known at these gatherings, known to be interesting, and people were beginning to seek her out rather than tolerating her presence. The evening was uneventful for the first 2 hours. Unremarkable dinners, fine wine, adequate conversation, the usual arrangements of a county accustomed to its own rituals. Miss Vane was placed between a pleasant but dull younger son and an older gentleman who was interested in agricultural drainage to the exclusion of most other topics, and she managed both with composure and occasional genuine interest in the drainage question, which the older gentleman found delightful. What happened after dinner was this. There was a man named Greville, a visitor from London, an acquaintance of Fothergill's, not a county man, which meant he did not know the lay of the land and had not taken the time to learn it. He was the kind of man who considered himself charming, who moved through drawing rooms with the assurance of someone accustomed to being received well, and who had a way of calibrating the attention he offered based on a swift, unconscious accounting of what could be got in return. He discovered Miss Vane in the drawing room, identified her correctly as a woman of no fortune and no particular connections, and decided on some calculus I found obscene that this made her a permissible target for the kind of attention that is not respectful. He was not explicit. He was the subtler variety of bad. Compliments with edges, proximity held a little too long, a hand that appeared at her arm to guide her through the room when no guidance was required. Conversation angled toward territory that was inappropriate, and then played off as wit when she did not respond to it. The suggestion, careful and deniable, that a woman in her position might find it advantageous to be pleasant to a man in his. He said something about her eyes that was not a compliment in any real sense, and followed it with something about her situation that was not a question, but was shaped like one. Miss Vane's face had done something I recognized, the expression of a woman who has identified a thing for what it is, and is now deciding on the most efficient way to end it. She said something precise and cool that turned the conversation in a direction he had not intended, and he laughed in the way men laugh when they have been checked and are pretending they were not. He shifted and she moved, and he moved with her, and she moved again, and the geometry of the thing was becoming apparent to anyone who was watching. I saw some of this, and was moving across the room when Edmund arrived first. He had been watching from across the drawing room for some time, I think. I do not know exactly when he began to watch. The dowager said later that she had seen him put down his glass and go still in the way he went still when something had his full attention, and that was perhaps 5 minutes before the rest of it. He crossed the room without hurry, which was somehow more authoritative than haste. I did not hear the whole of what Edmund said to Greville. I was close enough to arrive during the last of it and to hear the tone, which was not loud and was not threatening in any conventional sense, and was more effective than either. It was the tone of a man who has enormous authority and is choosing to deploy precisely as much of it as the situation requires, no more and no less, in the manner of someone who has no need to demonstrate what he could do considerably more if he chose to. There was a sentence that contained the word Hartwell, used as a noun, and a sentence that was a statement about the drawing room and who was in it. And Greville heard all of it and understood all of it and moved away, not quickly, because he was too vain for that, but he moved, and the territory was cleared, and Edmund did not watch him go because he was not the thing Edmund was looking at. Edmund turned to Miss Vane. She was composed. She was very good at being composed, but I was near enough to see that her hands were not entirely still, and that the composure was the effortful kind, the kind that looks like ease and costs something, and that the evening had cost something she had not been planning to spend. He said very quietly, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her a moment, not in assessment, in the particular way he had, she told me later, of looking at things he wanted to see clearly. "Are you certain?" "I am quite certain." She drew a breath very slightly. "It was not I have managed worse." A pause. "Though I am glad you—" She stopped. "You were going to say something," he said. "I was going to say I was glad you came," she said, "even though I do not need rescuing." "I know," he said, for the second time, and then, "I came anyway." She held his gaze. The noise of the drawing room continued around them, glasses and conversation, and the light movement of a room full of people, and they stood in the middle of it in a quiet that was their own. Then the Dowager appeared at Edmund's elbow, as the Dowager tended to appear when she was needed, with the uncanny timing of a woman who had been paying careful attention to everything for 78 years. "Edmund," she said pleasantly, as if she had merely come to collect him for nothing in particular, "you might tell Sir Thomas that Miss Vane is finding the evening fatiguing and will be returning to Hartwell presently." Edmund looked at her. "She is returning to Hartwell." "We all are," the Dowager said. "I am finding the evening fatiguing as well, and you, I think, have finished your business here." He looked at Miss Vane. She looked at him. The Dowager looked at both of them with the patience of the very experienced. "Yes," Edmund said. "I have." We returned to Hartwell in 2 carriages. I rode back separately. My estate is in the other direction, and the night was clear and cold with stars. I found myself thinking, as I rode, about a dinner table in October, and a young woman in a green dress saying she had come for Herschel, and a man deciding she was unsuitable before he had finished the soup. I did not learn what passed between Edmund and Miss Vane for the remainder of that evening until Edmund told me himself, 10 days later, which is when he had sufficiently reassembled himself to tell it. I will say it in his words, mostly, because his were more exact than mine. He said the Dowager had retired almost immediately upon returning, pleading the cough, which had returned briefly and conveniently. He said he had stood in the entrance hall with the hall candles lit, and Miss Vane had paused at the foot of the stairs with her hand on the newel post, and they had stood for a moment in the ordinary silence of a house at night. He said he had not planned what he said next. He said, "I want to show you something." She had waited. He had taken a candle from the hall table and led her, without further explanation, down the east corridor. She had understood where they were going before they arrived. She did not say anything. She simply followed him, the candle casting their shadows tall against the paneling, the house quiet around them, the clock in the hall marking the half-hour with a sound that carried down the corridor. He unlocked the door at the end. The rooms had the particular quality of spaces long unused, a faint mustiness, a stillness that is different from emptiness, the sense of things held in suspension. The moonlight came through the tall windows and lay across the dust-sheeted furniture in long, pale panels that made the room look like something between an attic and a chapel. He went through 2 rooms without stopping. In the 3rd room, the south-facing room, the one with the best windows, he stopped. In the corner, under a cloth, the telescope. He pulled the cloth away, and it came off in a slow billow of dust that caught the moonlight and settled. The telescope was a good one. His mother had understood instruments. It was brass and mahogany, old-fashioned even in its time, with the kind of solidity that comes from being built to last rather than to impress. The eyepiece had a worn patch where she had rested her brow countless times, over years, looking out and up and away. Edmund stood beside it for a moment with his hand on the tube the way a man stands beside something he has not permitted himself to look at directly for a long time, not touching it fully, just resting there, confirming it was real. Miss Vane crossed the room and stood beside him. She looked at the telescope for a long time without speaking. Then she reached out and touched the worn patch on the eyepiece. Not the barrel, not the stand, but the worn patch, and her fingers rested there, very briefly, with a kind of care that was not performing care. "She looked at this," she said. "For years," he said. "Then she saw a great deal," Cecily said. He told me he had not been able to answer. He said something happened in him then that was not theatrical and not sudden, simply a quiet loosening, as if a thing he had been holding for 11 years had been set down at last. Not dropped. Set down deliberately in a place that seemed safe enough to hold it. He stood beside the telescope in his mother's room with this woman he had called unsuitable, in the moonlight and the dust and the silence of 11 years, and the word had no meaning left in it at all. He was not sure it had ever had meaning. He thought he had been using it to mean something else, something he was now, finally, within sight of naming. He looked at her. She was still looking at the telescope, and then she felt him looking and turned, and whatever she read in his face was apparently enough because she did not look away, and neither did he, and the candle flame was the only moving thing in the room. He said, "I told my grandmother you were entirely unsuitable." "I know," she said, "I heard you." He was very still. "You heard me." "Through the library door," she said. "The first evening," she held his gaze without apology and without performance. "I was not pleased." "No," he said, "I imagine not." He looked at her steadily. There was something in his face she had not seen before, not the controlled precision he wore in the dining room, not the careful distance he maintained across the library, something that had stopped being managed. "I was wrong," he said. She raised an eyebrow very slightly. "Were you?" "Yes," he said. "I was wrong about what the word meant. I had been using it to mean not like the others, not manageable in the ways I was accustomed to managing, not something that fit into any category I had, and I experienced that as unsuitability." He paused. "It wasn't, I know that now. I think I began to know it quite early and chose not to, which is a different thing and perhaps less forgivable." She was quiet for a moment looking at him. "Why are you telling me this?" she said, not combatively, with genuine curiosity, the direct inquiry of a woman who wants the actual answer. "Because I am 34 years old," he said, "and I have spent the better part of a decade managing everything in this house and this county and this estate with great precision and no particular feeling, and I am tired of it. And because I think you may be the only person I have met since my mother died who does not want something from me that I have to calculate whether to give." He stopped. He looked at the telescope and then back at her. "And because it is late, and I am in this room for the first time in 11 years, and I am not willing to leave it without telling you the truth of the thing." She was very still. He said, "I do not want you to leave in the spring." She said quietly, "The arrangement ends in April." "Yes," he said, "I am asking about an arrangement that does not end in April. I am asking if you will stay at Hartwell as the Duchess of Hartwell if you will have it, and if you will have me as I am, which I should warn you is occasionally very difficult." A pause. "You are already aware of that." She looked at him. "I am," she said. "I should warn you in return that I will argue with you, not sometimes, consistently. About astronomy and horticulture and philosophy and the management of the drainage on the East Fields, which I have been looking at and think is being done incorrectly, and about a great many other things besides." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest thing and it entirely changed his face. "Is it?" he said. "The drainage," she said. "Yes, I am prepared to show you my reasoning at whatever hour is convenient." "I look forward to it," he said, and meant it. She held his gaze. "And I will not be managed," she said. "I know that is how you prefer to keep things, I understand why, but I will not." "I know," he said. "That is," he searched for the word, and she watched him search, and she did not rush him. "That is what I am counting on. That is precisely what I am counting on." She was quiet for another moment. The candle flame moved in a draft from the tall windows. The worn patch on the telescope caught the pale light and held it. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her with an expression she told me later she had never seen on any face before. Not happiness, exactly, not relief, exactly, but something that contained both of those and something underneath them that had no name she knew, but that she recognized. She said it looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just, at last, been permitted to put it down. They were married in April. The chapel at Hartwell is a small and very old building, stone-floored, with plain glass windows and plain stone walls, and the particular quality of a space that has held a great deal of human meaning over many years, and has learned to be quiet about it. On the morning of the wedding, the light came through the windows as it did in April, clear and unhurried, and the narcissus from the south wall bed had been cut and arranged along the aisle. Cecily had done it herself the evening before, with the same methodical left-to-right care she brought to everything, and they stood in their jars with the spring light on them and were very fine. I stood at Edmund's right. I had stood at his father's right at his father's wedding, in this same chapel, and I was aware of the echo and found it not melancholy but appropriate. The way things that repeat across generations are sometimes right, not because they are identical but because they connect one good moment to another, and the chain of them matters. Edmund stood at the front of the chapel in the way he stood at everything, composed, present, exact. But his face was different. It had been different for 2 months, since the evening in the East Wing, since the East Wing had been opened, and the cloth taken off the telescope, and the word unsuitable had finally run out of meaning. Something had lowered in him that had been held in precise maintenance for years. He did not look younger. He looked more like himself. It is a strange distinction, and I think an important one. There is the self a man presents to the world, and there is the self underneath it, and most men go to their graves with a considerable distance between the two. Edmund, in these 2 months, had been closing that distance. She came up the aisle on her father's arm, the Reverend Thomas Vane, a gentle, unhurried man with kind eyes and the expression of a man who has been proud of someone for 24 years, and is not surprised by this moment, but is deeply, quietly moved by it. He had come to Hartwell the day before, and Edmund had gone to meet him in the hall, and the two of them had sat in the library for 2 hours while Cecily arranged the narcissus. And Edmund told me later that the Reverend had said very little, but had looked at him with the careful attention of a father satisfying himself about something, and had eventually said, "She has been her own person her entire life, and I am very glad she has found somewhere that wants that." Edmund had said, "So am I," and that had been sufficient. Cecily came up the aisle in a dress that was ivory and simple and excellently cut. The Dowager had had some hand in the selection, I suspected, though the Dowager would not confirm this, and her hair was arranged with the usual care and was already, by the time she reached the end of the aisle, beginning to disagree with 2 of its pins. She looked at Edmund with the direct, unembarrassed attention that was entirely hers, the attention she had brought to Herschel and to the south wall bed and to the question of the drainage and to him, and I watched him look back at her and I thought, there it is. There is the face he has been keeping in reserve for 11 years, saving it without knowing he was saving it. The Dowager sat in the front pew in a gray silk dress and an extremely good hat, and she was perfectly composed throughout the ceremony. She had arranged it, after all. She had seen it coming when it was still far away, and she had set the geometry, and she had then waited with the patience of someone who knows that the only part that cannot be arranged is the part that matters. She was composed throughout, as I said, which I had expected. What I had not expected was that she dabbed her eyes once, very briefly, at the moment when Edmund said the old words, the real ones, and looked at Cecily while he said them, as if she were the thing he had been looking for in all those years of not knowing he was looking. I pretended not to notice. It seemed correct. Afterward, when the small wedding breakfast had wound down and Edmund and Cecily had gone out to the garden, to the south wall bed, which was coming up magnificently, the narcissus fully open in the April sun, the crocus already past, but the tulips she had added in March now in bud, the Dowager came to stand beside me. We watched them through the drawing-room window. Cecily was crouched at the edge of the bed, saying something about one of the plants, pointing at it with the focused authority of someone who has a strong opinion about horticulture. Edmund stood beside her and looked at whatever she was pointing at and said something back. She shook her head. He said something else. She said something that made him look at her, and then, quietly, privately, the smile that arrived without deciding to, he laughed. I had not heard Edmund laugh not like that in 30 years, perhaps longer. It was not a loud thing, it was simply real. Well, the Dowager said. Well, I agreed. She was entirely unsuitable, the Dowager said, in a tone of considerable satisfaction. I said that it appeared so. Unsuitable for the kind of man who needed a woman of suitable connections to stand decoratively beside him at county dinners and agree with his assessments of the drainage. She watched the two of them in the garden, Edmund now crouched beside her at the bed, examining whatever she had been pointing at with what appeared to be genuine interest. Edmund did not need that. He needed someone who was going to be herself regardless of his opinion of her. Someone who was not going to shape herself around his cold edges and call it warmth. Someone who would walk into the East Wing when he finally offered it. I said she had been very confident. I was not entirely confident, she said, which surprised me. I was hopeful. There is a difference. I know my grandson very well, and I knew he would resist, and I hoped he was not so well practiced at resistance that he would resist past the point of recognizing what was in front of him. She was quiet for a moment. He was not, which speaks well of him. I said it did. She is good for him, the Dowager said, and he will be good for her. She has been alone with her own good mind for 24 years, and that is a kind of loneliness too, perhaps the loneliness we speak of least, because it does not look like loneliness from the outside. She turned from the window. She will have the library and the telescope and the garden and a man who is very slowly remembering how to let things matter. And he will have someone who was never going to stop being entirely herself, and who saw what was in that East Wing and asked him to set it down. She retrieved her teacup. I would call that a satisfactory outcome. Outside in the garden, Edmund had apparently found something to say about the tulips that Cecily disagreed with, because she was shaking her head again with the particular resolution of a woman who has considered the matter carefully and reached a conclusion that does not require his endorsement. He was looking at her the way I had seen him look at her through 30 feet of drawing room and across dinner tables, and over the long evenings of January, with the full attention of a man who has stopped managing his regard for her and simply allowed it. She said something. He crouched down next to her and looked at the thing she was pointing at. He said something back. She tilted her head in a way that meant she was considering whether he might be right, which was the face she made before deciding he was not quite right but was in the neighborhood. He said something else. She laughed. I had mentioned this already, the laugh. I mention it again because I want it on record. It is one of the things I will remember if I remember anything. Edmund Hartwell in the April sun in the garden of his estate, 34 years old, crouching in the dirt beside the narcissus his mother planted, disagreeing about horticulture with his wife and laughing about the disagreement. The laugh was not performed. It was simply there, the way things are when they arrive from somewhere real and unmanaged. The Dowager beside me heard it too. She said nothing. But I saw her exhale very quietly, the exhale of a woman who has been waiting for something a long time and has just, finally, heard it. I thought of a Tuesday in October, and a small sitting room that smelled of beeswax and good paper, and an old woman saying, "I am merely optimizing the geography." I thought of a Thursday dinner and a library door, and a young woman in a corridor hearing herself called unsuitable, deciding in the particular way she decided things to simply unpack her trunk and be herself. I thought of Herschel and the nebular hypothesis, and a midnight argument that had no winner and was, by both parties' accounting, a productive conclusion. I thought of a worn patch on a telescope eyepiece, and a month of midnights in the library, and a south wall bed that came up magnificently in April. I thought of a man who had been carrying something for 11 years, and a woman who had known, without being told and without pressing, exactly where to let him put it down. The invitation had been sent in October. The answer had been coming ever since. She was entirely unsuitable, and she was exactly right, and the old woman in the very good hat had known it from the first word.